Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Yes, welcome back to the second session of Dr. Shippey's special seminar on Beowulf. Good to have you again here today. Keep in mind, again, if you're new, if you type stuff into the chat window there in your GoToWebinar control panel, then Dr. Shippey will be able to see your questions and address those at the end of his talk. Please do feel free to go ahead and start adding those as they occur to you along the way, and then he can see them all there at the end. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Shippey. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. Well, this talk is about Tolkien and the origins of England, but as always, there's a few things left over from last time which I didn't get round to addressing. There are a couple of questions which I saw but couldn't get to before we closed down. So let me just deal with those now. One, I think Sparrow asked, where did I get this strange term melon udrigal from? And the answer is, it's John Buchan's novel, Witchwood. That's Witch, W-I-T-C-H. We know that Buchan was actually Tolkien's favorite author, and people often take that wrongly, because what Buchan has remained famous for are his spy stories, like the 39 Steps, which has been filmed several times. But I don't think Tolkien meant those. I think he was really fascinated by, most of all, Buchan's historical novels. There are four of these which seem to me to be particularly Tolkienian. One is Witchwood, which has some Tolkienian scenes in it. Another is The Path of the King, which I'm sure was Tolkien's intended model for The Lost Road, which he, of course, never got round to completing. Another one is Midwinter. I've never met anybody who has read this novel, Midwinter, but it contains the word halfling. It has a character who's really very reminiscent of Gollum in the way he talks, and it has a climactic scene at the end which is very like the Samath Naur scene with the destruction of the ring. It's about destroying a ring, actually. And the fourth one is called The Blanket of the Dark, and that actually has something very like Rangers in it. So those four novels, The Path of the King is actually a set of linked short stories. But those four books, I recommend them to anyone who's interested in Tolkien. And you'll see what I mean, I think, it's pretty much as soon as you start reading them. I should say, though, that Witchwood is really a very sad novel, and so is Blanket of the Dark, really. But then Tolkien was quite capable of sadness as well, so that doesn't contradict what I was saying. It's just a kind of warning for you. So that was one question. Another one, I think it was Richard, asked about the author Jack Vance, who I said was the great master of fantasy onomastics, the invention of really inventive names. If you look at the website www.academia.edu and then type my name into the search button, the search panel, you'll see a whole string of things I put there, and one of them is my article, which is called Jack Vance, Il Ottimo Fabbro, and I'm referring, I guess, to T.S. Eliot's praise of Ezra Pound, whom he called Il Miglior Fabbro, the better creator, and I call Jack Vance the best creator, Il Ottimo Fabbro. So it's obviously an article in praise of Vance, who was, I think, the great author in the American fantasy tradition. Right, those are two questions. We also did not, I think, get to the bottom of the issue of the salvation of pre-Christians. And I asked the question, what was doctrine about the salvation of pre-Christians? And I picked a word up from one of the books I'll show you in a minute. Pre-Christians who were inculpable, who could not be blamed for not knowing about Revelation. Well, the answer is, I think, that there was no single doctrine, and I don't think there ever has been one, which is accepted by everybody, which is satisfying and accepted by everybody, including the Pope, the head of the Orthodox Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the moderator of the Kirk of Scotland. And I can't, in fact, imagine a single solution which would satisfy all of them. So there were just different opinions, but some were more authoritative than others. And here's one, Corey, if we could have the first slide. Right. When these come up on the screen, I don't read them to you because I know you can read them yourselves. And of course, as soon as I look at it, I see that there is a mistake in the heading. He wasn't Bishop Higgebald, he was Abbot Higgebald. Don't know why I didn't notice that before. But anyway, who was Alcuin? Well, first, his name wasn't really Alcuin, that's the way we always write it, but that's because the Latin alphabet is not good at dealing with Germanic sounds. His name was, I think certainly, Alquwain, and the Latin alphabet couldn't do the ch and it couldn't do the w either. And it means friend of the temple. It's an old pagan name. However, Alcuin, or Alquwain, certainly wasn't a pagan. He was a deacon of the Church of York. He was famous for his learning, and he was headhunted by the Emperor of the Franks, by Charlemagne, to join Charlemagne's Council of Advisor. And he became what in modern terms would be, I guess, Commissioner for Education across the European Union. So a very authoritative figure indeed. And he, for instance, had a great deal to do with the establishment of an authoritative text for the Latin Bible. So a very, very, very senior clergyman. And you can see what he says. What does he think about old-time heroes who lived in pagan eras, the old heroes? Well, he says, the house is narrow, it cannot contain them both. The King of Heaven will have no part with so-called kings who are heathen and damned. Well, I won't read it all for you, but let me just point out that Hinieldas, when he says, what has Hinieldas to do with Christ? Hinieldas is quite clearly the hero Ingeld, who is a character in Beowulf. And his story is actually told by Beowulf himself. But were they in fact having Beowulf sung in the monastery at Lindisfarne? Well, perhaps they were. But if they were, Alcuin does not approve of it at all. He thinks that kind of thing is completely intolerable in a Christian environment. Well, that's a hardline view. The Beowulf poet said was hard line about elves and orcs and giants and etins. He thought they were all as bad as each other. There was no point trying to distinguish them. And clearly Tolkien did not agree with him. We talked about that last time. But Alcuin is also a hardliner on the pagan problem. He thinks all that kind of thing should just be forgotten, abolished, not encouraged at all, and no compromise is possible. Of course, not everybody agreed with him. Clearly the Beowulf poet did not agree with him. And actually, clearly, Abbot Higgebald did not agree with him. That's what Alcuin is complaining about. But as I say, there was no single solution, no universally accepted opinion. It was a contest, really. And I don't like to take sides in it. Obviously, different people thought different ways. But the attempt to solve the problem of virtuous pagans kept on coming back. And curiously, it's often associated with the British Isles. The first heretic to get into trouble over this was a man called Pelagius, and he was British, not English, and I expect his name was really Morgan. Pelagius is a translation of Morgan. And he put forward a theory about how pagans might be saved, which of course was declared heretical. Another one, in my opinion, not everybody's, was someone very close in time and place to Beowulf, even more so than Alcuin, who was pretty close. But there was a monk at Whitby who wrote a story for which no source has ever been found. And people say, well, there must have been a source, must have been a source. He can't have made it up. Well, I think he did make it up. And he made up a story which was about how a pagan who had been an honest judge might be saved without being baptized. And the way he told the story, he was baptized because when Pope Gregory heard what a good man he'd been, he was standing by his grave and he wept, and the tears fell on the grave, and those tears were accepted as baptism. Well, it's a story which gets around the problem, you might say. How can the inculpable be saved if they haven't been baptized? And behind it, there's a feeling that you've got to be baptized. You can't be saved without being baptized. But okay, exceptions can be made. Well, you can see the problem, and you can see that the guy was trying to solve it. There's a similar story which Tolkien must have known very well, because it's very, very like another of his famous books, the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's written in the same dialect as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it's called St. Erkenwald, and it tells substantially the same story about St. Erkenwald. And there's one more that I could mention. I expect many of you have read the Narnia books, and the last of those books, The Last Battle, is all about virtuous pagans, isn't it? And in it, Lewis presents his solution to the problem. It doesn't matter whether you believe in Aslan or not during life. When you die, every person, when they die, has a vision of Aslan. And their reaction when they see that vision determines whether they are saved or damned. If they respond immediately with natural love and awe, they're saved. If they respond with fear and horror, they're damned. Yes, well, where did he get that idea from? Actually, I recognized it, I won't say straight away, because I read the book when I was quite young, but I recognized it eventually as the doctrine of the clara visio, the clear vision, which was put forward by a 14th century Oxford theologian from England called Uchtred of Bolden. Uchtred of Bolden. And it was, of course, condemned as heretical pretty much straight away. But how did Lewis come to find out about it? Answer, there was a British Academy lecture on the subject, just like Tolkien. So Lewis was probably in attendance when the lecture was given, and if he wasn't, he read it not long after. But anyway, there are quite a number of attempts to solve the problem of virtuous pagans, as I say, with a strong tendency to come from the British Isles, and the Beowulf poet is one of them. And as I said in my last lecture, I think that's the main thing that Tolkien learned from Beowulf. He learned this idea of, what should we call it, of a harmony, a sort of halfway house between the pagan and the Christian. Well, actually, after I gave the lecture last week, I realized I had a couple of books on the subject, and here's one of them. I'm going to hold it up and try and maneuver it so that it is in the center of the webcam. And if you can see, it's called Santi Pagani nella terra di mezzo di Tolkien. And Santi Pagani is Italian for virtuous pagans. So it's a whole book about the problem of virtuous pagans in Middle-earth, and it's written by my friend Claudio Testi. Testi, T-E-S-T-I. Well, it's a jolly good book, but it's all in Italian. If I had time, I'd translate it, but it would take me a long time to get my Latin up to speed to do it fast enough. Meanwhile, I've got another one here, which is by a Jesuit, and you can't say fairer than that. And there it is, Salvation Outside the Church, Tracing the History of the Catholic Response. And you can see it's by Father Sullivan, S.J., Society of Jesus. Well, what Father Sullivan is then admitting is that there was a history of the Catholic response, which means, of course, that it must have kept on changing. Somewhere down the line, I guess, there is a place for all these people I've been talking about. But I suspect that Father Sullivan doesn't know about any of those. He's not interested in literature. He's interested in theology. Still, perhaps I've said enough to say that there is what I call a granny problem. What happened to my granny? What is the fate of my granny's soul? Because she died before she ever saw a missionary. And you must see that that is, for some people, that must have been a painful question, for which different solutions were found. Okay, the other thing which I was talking about, as well as the granny problem, was to say that there was a fairy problem. Where did the non-human species fit in the Christian universe? And if we could have slide 2, Corey, the question was, were elves and fairies actually human? Did they have souls? Could they be saved? Where did they fit in the schema? And I told you that I knew of 6 different solutions, and you can see them on the slide there. That bit about they are the sheep, not of this fold. At one point, and I'm afraid I didn't look up the Bible reference, but at one point Jesus says, and I think I can remember it in the Latin form, alias always habeo, quae non sunt de hoc ovuli. I have other sheep who are not of this fold. And it's an enigmatic statement, and people understand it different ways. But one way in which some people understood it was to say that there was a Christian mission to the non-humans as well, though of course in the nature of things we don't know anything about it. Probably one of the other theories which needs a moment explanation is, what are neutral angels? Well, in the great war in heaven, when Lucifer was thrown down from heaven, there were angels who sided with Lucifer and they turned into devils. And there were angels which remained loyal, and they are angels. And there were also wishy-washy angels who didn't choose a side, and they of course were expelled from heaven, expelled to earth. And they can still be seen, and they are not hostile to humanity, unlike devils. And some writers, including the author of the South English Legendary, expressed the opinion that at the last day of judgment they might yet be saved. And he also thinks, of course, that this is the explanation for elves. They are angels who've been exiled to earth and who are waiting for the last judgment. Okay, half a dozen solutions to the fairy problem, none of them generally accepted, sometimes confused with each other, as in the manuscript of Beowulf, where the scribe, I'm sure it's the scribe, not the poet, isn't sure whether we're talking about Cain or Ham, partly because of the difficulties with the Latin alphabet. Well, yes, but did Tolkien not have the same problem? And was he not concerned about it? What were Tolkien's views on orcs? If we could have slide 3, Corey. I got this little set off Wikipedia, but fair enough. Could I say that the problem for Tolkien, which I'm sure he didn't realize from the start, is like this. Where do orcs come from? They can't have been created by Sauron, because it is a dogma which Tolkien often repeats, that evil cannot create. It is non-creative. It is an absence, not a presence. It's a negative force, not a positive force. So, as Treebeard says, the enemy cannot make, he can only mock. Trolls are made in mockery of Ents, and orcs are made in mockery of elves. But they can't actually be created from scratch. That would be a heresy. Yeah, so that means that they must be, well, the other half of the problem is if they are, shall we say, human, and they have souls, then they must be capable of salvation. And it would be most improper, I think, to just consign them all to damnation without further ado. So there's a kind of dilemma there. And Tolkien, as we can see, had 7 goes at it. And you notice the continuous use of the words fallen, corrupted, corrupted. That means that they haven't been created, they've been brainwashed in some way. And so their fates are their own, in the end, their own responsibility. As for the notion of sentient beasts, I think that's a contradiction in terms. So Tolkien, I think, he started off with the idea, which he got from Old Norse, that they kind of bred spontaneously in the earth, which is sort of what Jackson suggests in the Lord of the Rings movies. But that doesn't seem very satisfactory either, I'm afraid. And I think in the end, well, Tolkien wrote about it many times, and his last statement on it, I think, comes in The History of Middle-earth. I think it's volume 11, Morgoth's Ring, and there's an essay about it, pages 408 to 24. So if you want to see what Tolkien came out with finally, though not decisively, that's where to look. Well, so we had a granny problem and a fairy problem. Tolkien, I think, solved the granny problem to his own satisfaction by borrowing from Beowulf, but both he and the Beowulf poet had more trouble with what I call the fairy problem. Okay, that's all really been a kind of coda from last time, and now I should get on to the topic for this time, which is Tolkien 1982, which of course is this book here, Finn and Hengest, and the question, which I call the origin of England. Well, first, who were Finn and Hengest? And could I just say that most people say Hengest, but Tolkien, who was philologically scrupulous, always said Hengest, and I accordingly also always say Hengest. So, well, who were Finn and Hengest? Well, in the last lecture, I divided Beowulf up into 7 sections. You remember A1, 2, 3, 4, B1, 2, 3. The fights are B1, 2, 3, and the kind of bits in between are the A sections. Well, A2, the way I number them, is the section after the defeat of Grendel and before the fight with Grendel's mother. And what happens in it is that after Grendel has been defeated in the morning, the Danes who arrive at the Hall Heorot follow the blood trail which Grendel leaves. He's had his arm torn off. Naturally, he leaves a blood trail. They follow the blood trail to his lair in the Monster's Mere, and then they ride back. And as they ride back, a poet compares Beowulf to the hero Sigmund, whom we know, and Hermod, who is more obscure. When they get back, King Hrothgar is very pleased about the whole thing, expresses his thanks in a fulsome and rather misguided way, and then there's a feast. And at the feast, the Danish harper sings a song about Finn and Hengest. Well, the trouble is, what we get is a summary of the song, and it's really, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. In fact, it seems to start halfway through. It starts with a Danish queen who has been married to the Frisian king, lamenting. And what she is lamenting is fighting which has taken place in the night. So the summary we get starts with the morning after the night before. And there has clearly been fighting in the night and an attack on the hall. And in the morning she discovers that her son is dead, and so is her brother. So it focuses really on the sorrows of Hildebor, who has lost her unnamed son and her brother Knaf, who is incidentally a hero of the Half-Danes. A hero of the Half-Danes. Well, the fighting is terminated by a deal. The Danes surviving, the surviving Danes, who are still defending the hall they've been sleeping in, agree to come out, and they agree to serve Finn. And these surviving Danes are led by Hengest, who has taken over as leader after the death of their lord Knaf, Hildebor's brother. So they agree to come out and serve Finn, and Finn agrees to look after them and treat them well. And the most important stipulation is no one on the Frisian side is to say anything about the fact that the surviving Danes have agreed to serve the killer of their lord, because it is obviously deeply disgraceful, deeply dishonorable, and no one must mention it. Right, well, it then describes the cremation funeral of the dead, and this is still in Beowulf, it switches to describing Hengest's feelings during the winter, which follows this unfortunate fight at Finnsburg. And in the spring, when everything starts to thaw and Hengest's feelings also seem to thaw, Hengest is provoked into breaking the agreement, killing Finn, and taking Hildeburh, the Danish princess, back to her people. Well, this is full of awkward questions. Who started it? Whose fault was it? Hasn't everyone behaved badly? Hengest, huh? He surrendered instead of fighting to the death, and then he broke the agreement. As for the other side, they seem to have made a treacherous assault on guests, which again is utterly disgraceful. Another problem is that I've talked about it as if it's Danes against Frisians, but actually the term half-Danes has come up, and the blame seems to be put not on the Frisians, but on the Jutes. And the Jutes, they're neighbors of the Frisians, are not the same thing at all. And here is another embarrassment. Hengest, may I say, is not only an English hero, he's also on the Great Seal of the United States of America. But he appears to be, well, is it possible that the first national hero has become, well, I don't like to quote The Simpsons, but you know what the phrase is there, has become a surrender monkey? Surely not, surely not. It was very hard for British scholars to accept this. And also then, of course, he appears to be an oath breaker. So as a national hero and a kind of founding father, not only of England, but also actually of the United States of America, this is not what we want to hear. And of course, people spent their time trying to figure out some sort of way of explaining all this. Well, Tolkien typically thought of a quite different one from anything anybody else had ever said before. Typically, he started off for what appears to be the most difficult part of the whole affair, which is that we have Jutes attacking Danes, but among the Danes, or half-Danes, we have Hengest, who is clearly in a leading role. And Hengest, if it is the same man, and Tolkien certainly thought he was, and I think he was too, because there's only two people called Hengest, and they're living at the same time, and it seems the easiest solution to say they are the same man. Anyway, Hengest, the founder of the English Kingdom of Kent, was a Jute. So he's a Jute fighting for the half-Danes, but they're attacked by Jutes. Well, what is going on here? Well, Tolkien wrote the book, well, actually he gave a set of lectures which were eventually edited to become the book, really to explain his theory. But the book is one of the most difficult books I've ever come across in all my life. What it is, if you'll excuse me saying so, is 2,000 footnotes in search of a text. A large part of it is a glossary of names. So actually, Tolkien takes every name that's mentioned in the two poems, and there are two poems, and works through saying everything that can be said about them. But figuring out a kind of total explanation from that is not easy. So if you are reading the book, you'd probably better look at the reconstruction, which is some 5 or 6 pages at the end. But even then, it is hard to figure out what Tolkien meant. And fortunately, and very strangely, somebody understood it. And that's this book here. It's a young adult novel. It's called Hen Just, and the author is Jill Peyton Walsh. Now, Ms. Walsh as I shall call her, was a student of English at Oxford. As far as I can make out, she had no opportunity to hear Tolkien lecturing on the Finnsburg story. So how did she find out about it? Because her novel expresses Tolkien's scenario absolutely exactly. Well, I think I can explain that. One is that you will see that Finn and Hengest, can I get that to get in the center of the camera? This is like trying to write your name in a mirror. Edited by Alan Bliss. Okay, I found out that Miss Peyton Walsh's maiden name before she was married, was Bliss. I thought, well, I wonder. And Doug Anderson, who did the annotated Hobbit, I don't know how Doug finds these things out, but he found out she was in fact Alan Bliss's niece. So Tolkien's editor could have told her about it. But actually, there's an even better solution, which is that her novel is dedicated I don't know if you can see that, but it says to Elaine. And Elaine is Elaine Griffiths, one of Tolkien's graduate students, who was, of course, the one responsible for getting The Hobbit published. So I think it's very likely that Elaine told young Miss Bliss the story, and she decided to make it into a novel, which was her first novel. And after that, like so many of Tolkien's students, she had a rather successful career as a children's author, especially of fantasies. Well, if you want to know what Tolkien thought about the Finnsburg episode and the Finnsburg fragment, read Jill Peyton Walsh, Hen Just tale. It's much quicker and easier than trying to figure out Tolkien. But I can tell you the gist of Tolkien's theory, and it's essentially a Second World War theory. What Tolkien thought was happening was that the Danes, who had started off in southern Sweden and expanded into the Danish islands, were expanding further and pushing their way into Jutland, where they would encounter the Jutes. And actually, it seems to me that's exactly what the first few lines of Beowulf are talking about, when it says that shield shaving it's a crux. I can't really explain it all very quickly, but it says really that shield shaving rolled up many tribes and took away their mead halls. He took away their mead halls. If you take away someone's mead hall in these circumstances, you are basically taking them over. You are rolling smaller kingdoms or communities or whatever and making them part of the Danish Empire. So the Danes are expanding in a kind of imperial way across Jutland. And of course, this is resisted by many, if not most, of the Jutes. Well, many, but not all. And that's where the half-Danes come in. Tolkien suggests that you really had a kind of, as I say, a World War II situation. Some of the Jutes became collaborator Jutes with the Danes and were called half-Danes. And the other Jutes who did not agree with that, they had to flee. They had to go into exile, where they became what in World War II terms would be free Jutes, like the Free French or the Free Dutch or the Free Norwegians. You join a still independent nation and try to recover independence for your own occupied country. Well, the obvious thing is that the Free Jutes and the half-Dane Jutes, they really dislike each other. They hate each other. One lot considers the others as traitors and collaborators, and the other lot calls them, I suppose, deserters and refugees. So when the Free Jutes take shelter at the Frisian court and the Danes come on a visit and the half-Danes come on a visit, this is a recipe for trouble. Obviously, Hengest himself, as a leader of the collaborator Jutes is a natural target for the free Jutes, and they are pretty much bound to have a go at it. Yeah. Was this worth a whole book for Tolkien? Obviously it was. I mean, it was worth lecturing on again and again, and it turned into a whole book. And that's because I think it has to do with the origin of England. Now, I'm running over time, so I'm going to cut this short. I'll just say that the whole question of English identity is very difficult, and getting more difficult all the time. Actually, it's become a political hot potato now. But if we could have slide 4, Corey. These are quotes by Tolkien, and you can see that he twice distinguishes England from Great Britain. English, not British. And he is devoted not to Great Britain and not the British Commonwealth, but only to England. And that's a sore point, is all I can say. Actually, I'll show you one thing. Have a look at my passport. See what it says there. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's the country I live in, the UK. Most people who live in the UK don't even know that. They think they live in Britain, or Great Britain. And Great Britain's a stupid term anyway. It's just translated from French, I'm afraid. When I fly to America, if I see my countrymen filling in their immigration forms, I always nudge them and say, look, where it says nationality, do not write GB. If you write GB, the American border officials will send you to the back of the queue because they know there's no such country. And quite often they say to me, what do you mean? I say, the country you live in is UK. Write down UK. However, the UK Olympic team at the last Olympics went off with all their tracksuits labeled GB, Team GB. I thought that was a terrible mistake to make. I thought it was an insult to Northern Ireland, actually. But there you are. People get very confused about it, and I'll say no more about that. But European identities were mostly created quite recently. And the UK, for a start, really quite a recent invention. But part of the way they were created was by discovering early epics which could be construed as representing national identity. El Cid for Spain, La Chanson de Roland for France, Nibelungenlied for Germany. But the best example actually is the Finnish Kalevala, which we know influenced Tolkien very deeply and very early. His first story of Kullervo was a straight take from Kalevala. But I could say, I think, quite definitely, Finland, the nation Finland, would not exist now if it had not been for Kalevala. It was Kalevala which gave the Finns a sense of identity and enabled them to become a country independent both of Russia and of Sweden. Before that, they did not have that sense of identity. Kalevala was imitated all across the eastern Baltic. Do you know what the American Kalevala is? Well, I'll tell you. It's Hiawatha. That is quite clearly an imitation of Kalevala, which Longfellow hoped would help to create a sense of American identity. Well, this kind of identity politics was very powerful in medieval studies. And when everybody was running around trying to find their national epic, the English were kind of lucky. They got Beowulf. No, they weren't lucky. It was a disaster. It's an epic, yeah, and it's a jolly good one, and it's in English, but it never mentions England. The author doesn't seem to know where it is. And the only English characters in it are Hen Just. Not terribly helpful for a national epic, and Offa, who is quite clearly not King Offa of the Mark, but a remote ancestor of his, who again had never seen England and never heard of it. So actually, Beowulf as an identity-creating national epic was a kind of a dead loss. Yeah, and that is why Tolkien thought he'd better do something about it. He wanted, as he said, to create a body of legend which he could dedicate to England. And his first idea was to write his fairy mythology, shall we call it, and his first idea was to say that he would identify England with Tol Eressëa. England would be Tol Eressëa. Could we have the next slide, Corey? There was a problem with that, which is actually that Britannia, the island of Britain and the province of Britannia existed long before England did, and actually trying to skip over that naturally raised serious questions about how all these things had happened. So Tolkien wasn't quite sure how to deal with that, I think. But what he came up with was a series of ideas about the figure of Ariel. Ariel, well, perhaps you see the point I'm making. His original name is Ottor. He calls himself Wavra, wavering, wandering, which is a name prominently used in the Finnsburg story. Sorry, a word prominently used in the Finnsburg story. And one of his sons are Hen Just and Horsa, the legendary founders of England. So Ariel, he also adopts the name of Angol, which I think is an idea Tolkien dropped, but he was going to make him a kind of progenitor of England. But Ariel, in his stay in Tol Eressëa, learns one way and another, and Tolkien kept changing his mind about that, he learns one way or another the kind of fairy mythology of Tolkien and passes it on. What Tolkien is saying is, these stories I'm telling you, I'm explaining where they came from. I'm explaining how they got to me. And could I say that Tolkien, because of his professional instincts, was always both fascinated and perturbed by the issue of transmission. He didn't just want to know what something was, he wanted to know how it got there. Just as he didn't want to know what a language was, he wanted to know how it had changed and developed. His idea of a text, we could say, was always dynamic. It wasn't fixed at one point in time, it had come from somewhere and it had been altered in the course of transmission. Well, Ariel was his solution to the transmission problem. And could I say that I think I first said Ariel is a kind of Bilbo figure, but actually it's the other way around. Bilbo is the kind of late variant on Ariel, because where does the Lord of the Rings come from? Well, if you read the end of the prologue to Lord of the Rings, there's a long and rather detailed explanation of how all these stories came to be passed on. It starts off with Bilbo's diary, which is added to by Frodo, and then Bilbo's 3 volumes of Elvish translations from the Elvish are added in, and they become the Red Book of Westmarch, which is copied and becomes the Thane's Book for Peregrine, and is copied again under the orders of King Elisar by the scribe Findegil. And that then is the chain of transmission which leads to Lord of the Rings. Tolkien felt in a way that a book wasn't alive unless you knew how it had been transmitted. So, since that is the case, he had to think up transmitter figures like Bilbo and like Ariel. Next slide, if we may, Corey. I'm rushing through this rather. Tolkien, as I say, kept changing his mind about Ariel. And eventually he became not a figure from the 5th century, father of Hen Just, a figure of the mid-5th century. He becomes actually someone from a much later period, like probably, I would say, 10th century. And he's become not someone who has stayed on Tol Eressëa and come back from it. He's an Englishman who sails westward and picks up legends on his in his journeys. Well, all I've done actually is to give a couple of excerpts from Book of Lost Tales 2, from The Shaping of Middle-earth, and it would be quite a difficult job actually to go through all the permutations which Tolkien went through. And that's not the end of it. Again, if you want the end of it, or the last version, you would have to look at the History of Middle-earth volume, which I call Jewels, in which there's a section called Alquwain and Dirhavel, and that gives Tolkien's last words, I think, on this whole issue. But the real point is this. Tolkien originally decided to connect his mythology with the origins of England by making Ariel stroke Ottor the father of Hen Just and Horsa. And he could also be called Alquwain, though that would not be a name, it would be a description, because it means friend of the elves, elf friend. So Ariel could also be called Ariel Alquwain, because that's what he was. He was a friend of the elves. Well, one thing that arises out of that is this rather enigmatic figure, Ariel, Ottor, Alquwain, whoever we decide to call him. He's an image of Tolkien, isn't he? He's the one who knows the true tradition of the fairies. And Tolkien is just the last stage in that transmission. And in a sort of a way, Tolkien believed that. He thought that he was the last bearer of this old tradition. And that's one of the things that he thought was important about the Finn story, because the hero of the Half-Danes is called Hnaf, and Tolkien thought that was very personal to him. When I met him, I can't remember which order he asked me these, but let's say he asked me first what was my explanation of the Oxfordshire place name Hinksey. And I said, well, it's Hen Just's the island of the stallion. And he said, yes, but it could also be the island of Hengest. And then he asked, actually I was telling him about the old Edwardians rugby results. And he said, I always wear my old Edwardians tie on these occasions. I was telling him about the old Edwardians rugby results, and Tolkien was really interested, which most people wouldn't be. And I just ran through the names of the team, and I got to our winger, who's called Peter Neave, N-E-A-V-E, and Tolkien was immediately interested. And he asked me what I thought the etymology of the name Neave was. And I said, well, I guess it's Old North Nephi, fist. It could be a nickname. And he said, yes, but it could also be the name Hnaf, just like Hinksey is from Hen Just. But of course I now know, I didn't realize then, that what Tolkien was wondering about was whether my friend Peter was a cousin of his, because he had an Aunt Jane called Neve, and he wanted to try and figure out the relationship. But that of course was connected with Finn and Hengest. If you could have our next slide, Corey. You can see that I said the right thing when I said Hnaf could be a connected etymology with Nephi. And Tolkien also notes that the names Hnabi and Nebi are found in Old High German, and he suggests that the Nibelungs, the Nibelungar, could also be the Hnivlungar. So that could also be the name of Hnevi, and it ends up, if so, though we have no Norse story of Nephi, he must once have been a figure of importance in legend. So Tolkien thought that Hnaf was actually a more important person in legendary tradition than we realized, because we have so little of it. Well, And he also thought that he liked that thought because he thought that he himself was related to the whole Hnaf Neve family tree, you might say. So he himself personally had a kind of connection with these ancient heroes. Well, there are several things I wish I'd been able to tell Tolkien about. Of course, I didn't get the chance. Partly because I didn't know them at the time, and nor did anyone else. But I'd like to tell him that many of us now think that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was not written in Cheshire, as people used to say, but actually in Staffordshire, which would make it much more local to Tolkien. And the other thing I'd like to tell him is that when he says in Old High German these terms Knabi and Nebi are found, they've been found a lot more than he ever knew. My friend Carl Hammer wrote a very long article about it all in the Journal of Medieval Prosopography. Prosopography is like Leographia. It's a census of names. And, you know, not everybody reads the Journal of Medieval Prosopography. Well, they're missing something there. But my friend Carl Hammer has pointed out that it was actually quite a widespread name among a noble Bavarian family. And he thinks that they got the legend from Anglo-Saxon missionaries, and they were attracted by the legend, and they decided to use these aristocratic names as a kind of form of self-assertion. Well, I think Tolkien would have liked the idea of Anglo-Saxon missionaries, whatever Deacon Alquwain might say, Anglo-Saxon missionaries spreading the story of his ancestor Hnaf of the Half-Danes so successfully that a whole noble family continued to call themselves by this name for generations. Tolkien's attempt to make his mythology an English mythology was, I think, a failure. It's become a universal mythology instead, and that's good. That's better than what Tolkien was aiming at. But Finn and Hengest as a book, sorry, I won't hold it up again, you know what I mean. Finn and Hengest as a book, it did show one thing, and that is that in spite of what Tolkien said in 1936 about rescuing Beowulf from the fairy godmother Historia and restoring the poem to poesis, taking the poem from history and restoring it to poetry, in spite of what he said there, he took Beowulf as a historical document very seriously indeed. Very seriously indeed. And so do I. He thought it really was a window into the very darkest of dark ages. And that was the time when the European nations were being formed. If you could have the last slide, Corey. Yeah, I always thought this was a very suggestive sentence or so. The story of Ingeld is chiefly interesting as an episode in a larger theme, as part of a tradition concerning moving events in history, the arising of Denmark, and wars in the islands of the north. Rather like the wars of the orcs and the dwarves, which took place out of sight and no one knows anything about them. But actually, no doubt that is what was going on, but they're not quite out of sight, because Beowulf tells us something about them, and from that we can infer a good deal more. So next time I'm going to talk about Beowulf as history and Tolkien's 2014 publication with his commentary on Beowulf, because in that he actually gets round to explaining what he meant by a product of art and by the glamour of poesis. He said in his 1936 lecture, we mustn't let the glamour of poesis fool us, but he didn't say what it was. Well, in the 2014 publication, we find out what it was, and it is actually very interesting indeed, very original, and very inspiring, I think. Okay, that's what I have to say this time. Oh, and one other thing, I really must start off next time with the poem King Sheev, which is so suggestive and which brings together most of our themes like theology, mythology, history, and poetry. So I'll try and remember to start off with King Sheev next time, but my main subject will be the glamour of poesis. Thanks very much. Okay, now let's see what questions I have to answer. And the first thing I've got to do is to open up the question panel, which is giving me a bit of trouble. Corey, can you remind me how to open up the question panel so it's a bit more visible? Actually, have I found it? Nope.
So, there should be that little button, the square with the arrow pointing out of it, over on the right-hand side of in the control panel, right? There's the
Up
part
at the
that
top.
says question, and on the top
got
bar.
it. Got
There
it.
you go.
Yeah. Right. But it still hasn't. It still hasn't opened up. I unlocked the control panel from the screen.
So did it pop out there at all?
No, I can only see small amounts. I'm actually scrolling up to the top, but I've only got a kind of I can only see about a line at a time. Now I know there's a way of opening this up, but I've forgotten what it is.
Yeah, it should just be that. But did you hit the square with the arrow in it button to pop it out? Right next to where it says questions.
Ah, yeah, okay. Well, I've clicked on that. Still not working. Nope. Okay, I can see where it says question, asker, received, answerer, answer. Where's the arrow that I should be looking for? To the...
Oh, yeah. So if you right, the main menu. So where it says questions in the
Yeah.
above there, on the
Yeah.
right-hand side, there should be the little box with the arrow in it.
A little box with a cross in it.
Yeah, that'll do.
Okay. Well, nope. Still
Should be.
as narrow.
It should just say undock pane from panel. Is what it says. If you mouse over it.
Nope.
If you'd like, I could just go through and read you questions.
Okay, well let's do that. So as we got to move on, I'll just keep fiddling with it. But give me the first question, and we'll think about it. I can see that I think it's Sparrow says thanks for the fucking recommendations. Tony asks me, do I think Tolkien actually believed in fairy and fairies? And the answer is no, I don't think so. Mind you, the belief was pretty widespread. In Leeds University, their special collections had all the material for the Cottingley fairies. This was a kind of a hoax. We know it was a hoax, in which some naughty little girls made some rather obvious faked pictures of fairies, but a lot of people actually believed they were true, and they still do. The librarian told me it was the most sought out set of materials in the collection, which I think he thought was rather depressing. So certainly people did believe in fairies, but I think Tolkien didn't. He perhaps believed in fairyland in a way, but I don't think he thought that it was accessible in any way. Andrew asks whether the Beowulf poet is referring to theories about the Nephilim in Genesis 6. Well, yes. Yes, I think he knew something about that. There was actually quite a this is a question that worried people, and there was quite an intensive tradition of commentary on Genesis 6, and we can't be quite sure what was circulating in Anglo-Saxon England at the time, and you might well think not very much because they hadn't got very many books, but certainly there was a continuing interest in that, and it's not impossible that some of it got through. But the truth is that most Anglo-Saxon libraries were destroyed during the Viking Wars, and we can't be sure what they had available. One thing I noticed a long time ago, there's a set of very poor quality Latin sermons called the Sermones ad Fratres in Eremo, sermons to the brothers in the desert, and it's in very poor quality Latin, and its theology is enough to make you feel pretty worried actually. And the editors of it, who are French, ascribe this to an unknown Belgian. But the only reason they ascribe them to an unknown Belgian is because the sermons frequently mention beer. And to a French editor, beer is Belgian. There is another possibility, is there not? These sermones ad fratres were definitely known to Anglo-Saxon poets. So I've always wondered whether they could not be shown to be Anglo-Saxon work. But one of the troubles is that they were so darn popular that there's manuscripts all over Europe. There was a kind of market, I think, for interesting theology about giants and devils and monsters and whatnot, and somebody out there was supplying it, and I suspect he was an Englishman. So quite possible is the answer to Andrew's question. Sparrow says, Hen Just is an eagle? No. Did I say he was an eagle? Oh, well.
I think she's referring to your comment about the Great Seal of America.
Oh, no. Of course, I've never studied the Great Seal of America, but I gather there is a picture on the Great Seal of America of Hen Just and Horsa storming ashore from whatever it was they came from. But I'd have to look at the iconography of the whole thing to be able to work it out, and I must say I never have. So just count that as a mere hearsay on my part. Ilya, of course, comments very correctly on the historical novel Thorstein of the Mere by a guy called Collingwood, W.G. Collingwood, who had a famous son, R.G. Collingwood, who was actually a professor at the same college as Tolkien. So they must have known each other quite well. But Tolkien, I'm sure, knew all about W.G. Collingwood, who was in many ways a kind of predecessor of Tolkien, and also a founder of the Viking Society, which Tolkien again would have approved of. Yes, so actually Collingwood's books are, well, last time I looked, they're still available. There's a press in Wales which prints them. One is called Thorstein of the Mere, and the other one, I've got both of them, is called The Bondwomen, which actually was a bit scandalous in its time of publication, because it, you'll find this hard to believe, but it portrays English women as sex slaves for Vikings. And that's that was pretty serious stuff at the time. I think many people were very reluctant to believe that this could ever have happened. national feeling is a great, has far more effect on scholarship than people are ready to realize. A lot of the commentary on Finn was an attempt by English authors to say our ancestor cannot be blamed for anything, it was all someone else's fault. Anne says Hiawatha, I don't know why, but I could tell you a lot about Hiawatha, actually. Perhaps I'll say one or two things. There's no doubt it takes a lot from Kalevala. And the other, of course, is that it takes a lot from a chap called Schoolcraft, who made a collection of Iroquois, no, I tell a lie, Chippewa fairy tales, folk tales. But that's really exactly like Kalevala, which also, and its several Baltic successors, which also relied heavily on folk tales. So it was a determined effort by Longfellow, who was a very learned man, a very, very learned man, to actually produce a kind of American tradition which would be parallel to the most powerful European national tradition which he knew of. Longfellow, his star has fallen and nobody takes him seriously now, but my word, he knew an awful lot, and he was incredibly popular at the time. He's just been, I don't know why his star has fallen, but he's perhaps the the most downrated American poet that there is, and I think that's unjust, actually. Tony asks how I think Tolkien reconciled his Catholic faith with his admiration from the pre-Christian legends and myths and people. Well, actually, I think he found it jolly difficult. My pal Claudio Testi says that what Tolkien was trying to do was create an armonia, a harmony between pagan and Christian. And I think that's what Tolkien tried to do, and I think tried to do very successfully. But I also think he got more and more worried about it as he got older, and he began to wonder whether he'd done the right thing. Because, you know, in a way, well, that's what I said about the granny problem. In a way, they're incompatible, and you have to work really hard to make them harmonious or compatible. Yes, I think it worried him. John Steen Redeker says, how much history can we get from an epic that is inherently fictional? Well, we don't know that it's inherently fictional. We assume it's fictional. I grant Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon, they're fictional. But the material, as it were, in the background, I think is actually historical. And I think that's one of the things that nearly everybody agrees about Beowulf, that it is a stratified poem. There is a folktale stratum, which is what everyone knows about, and there is a historical stratum, which has no doubt been fiddled around with and altered and, you know, adapted to suit different requirements. But there is I think it's more historical than people have realized. And actually, if you want to know why I think that, go to Academia Edu. Oh no, I was going to say look up my article on the names of Beowulf, but I haven't actually put it up yet. So I'll consider doing that at some later date. But I'll say something about it next time. The buried history in the lost tales of Beowulf. That's quite a good topic, actually. The buried history in the lost tales of Beowulf. So I think, like Tolkien, I think the poet was working from legendary material, which was certainly thought by the people who were passing it on to be essentially true. The question of Boromir and Gondor, Boromir shows the dangers of nationalism, and Tolkien loving England. Does that show the dangers of nationalism? That's what people say nowadays. I told you it was a sore point. Could I just point out that in much of England, the flying of the English flag is banned because it's regarded as nationalist. But the flying of the Scottish flag in Scotland is perfectly okay. So how come it's all right for some people to be nationalist and not other people to be nationalist? Isn't flying the American flag nationalist? Of course it is. Well, okay. Perhaps one could make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism is loving your country. Nationalism is hating other countries. In that sense, is Boromir a nationalist or is he a patriot? Well, okay. I think I'll leave that question. Alex says he had trouble finding the section that Tolkien translates a man of keen wit, the counterpart of the Two Towers. If you're talking about Tolkien's Beowulf translation, it's when Beowulf arrives on the coast of Denmark, no, really near the start, about line 300. He turns up, the Coast Guard challenges him, Beowulf replies saying who they are, but without giving his name, and that's the point when the Coast Guard comes out with his proverb. And after he's given the proverb, he says, okay, I've decided, you people are okay, I will lead you to the Danish court. So not only does he say that a man of keen wit must be able, in my view, to decide from words as well as deeds. Having said that, he says, and I have decided. So it's a scene of someone making up his mind. And that is also true of Harma. Alex says he's got the bit where it says, what warriors are ye clad in corselets? It's about 20 lines after that you will find the proverb. Alex also says, very truthfully, that Longfellow is still popular but not regarded by English departments. Right. Well, whenever this comes up, I always remark on how unreliable my former colleagues are, professors of English literature, a bad lot. They get everything wrong. So we need to take too much notice of their ratings. Carl from Colombia says that he thought, and Carl is almost certainly right, that Jefferson proposed the inclusion of Hen Just and Horsa on the seal, but it didn't get there to the finished design. Oh well, okay. So the idea was there, but it's not there now. That is probably the version of which I got a garbled sense. But I'll see if I can find the Great Seal actually and have a good look at it. John Steen comes back to say, if Tolkien was trying to harmonize from the start, why did he call the Valar gods in the earlier versions? Is that why he changed this when he got older? Yep, that's right. I think Tolkien, when he was young, gave himself several problems for when he was older. One was the Valar, the gods, and I still think Lewis helped him out with that and gave him a kind of better explanation of it all. And the other was the orcs, which Tolkien never really managed to solve to his own satisfaction. But the guy who wrote about this very well is my friend Ronald Hutton, and I'll have to look the reference up. But he wrote a very interesting piece about Tolkien and paganism. And Ronald is himself a pagan, actually, one of the neo-pagans. So he has a different angle from most people. But I'll find the reference and I'll have it for you next time. It's a very good article. But what he says actually is that is just that Tolkien did keep changing his mind, and that he also, later in life, was trying to cover his tracks. um, because he felt he'd perhaps gone a bit too far. Um, yes, Kate says Ariel turns into Bilbo, and Tolkien actually calls himself a hobbit in all but size. Quite so. Um, yes, Kate also says this maxim about judging, isn't that also what Aragorn says to Éomer about how to judge in these hard times? Actually, um, someone has just sent me a book which I haven't read yet, and it's called whoops, The Proverbs of Middle-earth, and it's by um, David Rowe. So he has obviously made, well, it's a 200-page study of just that topic, the Proverbs of Middle-earth. And when I have read it, I dare say I'll know more than I do right now. Yes, Alex points out that Lewis said that Yeats believed in fairies. Yes, I'm not surprised. And Conan Doyle did, which is more surprising. Not sure about J.M. Barrie, but belief in fairies was quite widespread, as I say. Conan Doyle was taken in by the Cottingley fairies. John says, how do you figure out the historical bits from the fictional ones? Yeah, well, short answer, if there's corroboration, especially if, perhaps the obvious one actually is if it wasn't for the fact that Beowulf's uncle Higelac got himself killed on the mainland of Europe, in what's now the Netherlands, we might think that everything, the whole lot was fictional, because we've got no evidence about any of the others from outside Scandinavia, and also from much later. But with Higelac, we have 4 witnesses, documentary witnesses, which are contemporary or quite close to contemporary. So he was a real person. And if he was a real person, then there's a very good chance that the others are all real people. But if we didn't have that corroboration, we could say, oh, the whole thing's fiction. But now we can't. And I'd add that Higelac is a representative of the most obscure and unknown royal dynasty, because they got wiped out. So he would be the easiest one to dismiss as fiction, but he's the only one we can't dismiss as fiction. But there are other corroborations, I think, of what's said in Beowulf, not all of them recognized, because people were taken in by Tolkien, decided it couldn't be historical, and stopped looking. Well, I'll get too excited if I go on talking about this, but I promise to bring up at least one of these cases next time, though it's not an easy one to explain, but it makes horribly good sense once you figure it out. Yeah, Andrew mentions Collingwood's book, The Philosophy of Enchantment, which is very odd. It has indeed got interesting parallels with Tolkien. The two guys must have had lunch together 3 days a week, but neither of them mentions the other. Perhaps they're hiding something. Perhaps they're covering their tracks. But certainly, or possibly they didn't get on with each other, because there were areas where I think Tolkien and Collingwood Jr. were not in agreement. But Tolkien and Collingwood Sr. were in agreement. So you can never tell what sort of personal friendships or animosities lie behind these things. But certainly the two men were very closely connected at Pembroke, of course. The Great Seal of the United States, perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but it's Ilya, says that he's found something on Wikipedia. Jefferson proposed that the seal have Hengest and Horsa on it, and they were called the Saxon chiefs, from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we assumed. Well, I don't know if Thomas Jefferson was descended from Hen Just. I myself am of Jutish ancestry, so perhaps I am, but I don't think Hen Just had any political principles apart from taking revenge and knocking people off. I don't think that's what Jefferson meant somehow. Still, Hengest and Horsa were obviously important people to the early founders of the USA, as of some British historians. Kate brings up the topic of infant death. There are comments also. The sheep not of this fold is the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 16. And it is, of course, interpreted in different ways. And the standard interpretation is to say, I think, that Jesus is saying that he is not talking only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. But people who are looking for a kind of explanation of the non-human species adapted it for their purpose. It's pointed out that the Icelandic scholars of the Middle Ages, like Snorri Sturluson, this is Halstein talking, managed to harmonize their ancestors' beliefs to a degree. That's so. And of course they did lots of things. Another thing which you quite often get mentioned is that sometimes the Icelanders would dig up their ancestors, like Eötl Skallagrimsson, and rebury them in consecrated ground. You might say, well, that doesn't work because you can't make it retrospective. But actually, obviously, people thought it was worth a try. That even if your ancestors had been pagan and had never been Christian, just the same, you could give them a Christian burial and hope for the best. And all I can say is that seems not unreasonable to me. Halstein also comments on the landscape near the 6 halls excavated at Gamla Lyra in Denmark. And actually, there's a term for this. Just to the west of Lyra is an area which I think is called an area of old ice, which has been much carved up by glaciers. And that is, I mean, most of Denmark is really extraordinarily beautiful and well cultivated. So there aren't many kind of wilderness areas there. But one of the patches of rough territory and swamp and bog is indeed quite close to Lyra. I've always meant to go and have a walk around there, but I've never actually had time to do it, though I visited Lyra a couple of times. Tom Hillman comments on Vance's successful development of different kinds of fairies in his Lyonesse series, which again is, I think, a great work. It's a trilogy. The first 2 books are cracking good. The third one going off a bit. But the first, it's called Lyonesse. The first one is called Suldrun's Garden. The second one is called The Green Pearl. And the third one is called Maduk. But if you haven't read those before, I envy you, because it's a great experience to read them. Yes. Used to talk about Conan Doyle. I mean, this is really not to do with our main theme, but Why was he so gullible? Well, after World War I, with all the dead, there was a great vogue for spiritualism. People trying to get in touch with their dead. There are a lot of stories about it. I think Doyle was affected by that, and it's only natural, really. There's some powerful stories about it by Kipling, actually, who was also, of course, he lost his son in World War I, and they never found the body. Well, they did just a few years ago, but they never found the body while Kipling was alive, and he was very strongly marked by grief, I think. He wrote a poem called My Boy Jack, which is another of the really sad ones. I haven't got a book about creating imaginative place names, Andrew. I'll just say that Vance is, I think, the great creator of imaginative place names. But as I say, my article on Academia Edu will give you some examples of that. Somebody asks about, who is it? Tony asks about academics searching for national identity in medieval studies. Am I referring to those in the 19th century? Yeah, sure. The book about that, which I think I recommend to everybody, is called National Thought in Europe, and it's by another friend of mine called Joep, J-O-E-P, Leersen, L-E-E-R-S-S-E-N. Joep is at the University of Amsterdam, and he, actually, there's a website. Look at Ernie, Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe. That will tell you enormous amounts about the development of Romantic nationalism. And I have, not only have I said, I've actually written it somewhere. Romantic nationalism is the most politically significant intellectual movement of the 19th century, bar none. More significant than Marxism, say. That's what created the map of Europe. And in a sense, I think I've already said this isn't very popular, the failure of the European Union at the moment is caused by the fact that it has nothing to put up against romantic nationalism. What you want is romantic internationalism, but we haven't got any of that. But romantic nationalism was immensely powerful in creating editions of medieval texts, rewritings of medieval texts, historical novels, poems, symphonies, Dvorak's New World Symphony, all the Kalevala inspired stuff, and also art. Yeah, there's a website. Have a look at it. There's enormous amounts of material there, but studied mostly in Europe. I go to conferences with these guys, and I'm usually the only English speaker present because we don't take an interest in it. That is a mistake, I think. What can we do about the dominance of the professors of literature, Eric? We don't need to do anything. I'm not gloating over this, you understand, despite grinning. Old Norse glotta actually means to grin. But then I think when Old Norsemen were grinning, they were usually gloating, so that's... I'm not gloating about it, but the number of undergraduates majoring in the humanities has been going down for some considerable time, and the number of those majoring in English literature has been going really down. And I can't help thinking that's because my former colleagues, the professors of English literature, have been offering an inferior product. That's what happens in the market, you know. You offer an inferior product, nobody buys it. That's just my opinion, and I have been retired for 8 years, so I don't have to fight this argument anymore. But you notice for many years, you couldn't get a course on about Tolkien or a course on about science fiction. Oh, no. They weren't literature. They were just entertainment. But now people are putting on courses because why? Because they need the students. No students, no faculty. So the professors of English literature are slowly having to respond to this by satisfying the market demand. But for a long time they set their faces like flint against it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. So we'll just have to leave them to the care of time. The story about the Whitby monk is in the Life of Gregory the Great. Jim Hart asks this, and the Life of Gregory the Great was edited and translated by a guy called Cosgrove, not Cosgrave, Cosgrove, which I dare say will be available in some. It might be online by now. Look for the Life of Gregory the Great by the anonymous Whitby monk. And I think, as I say, the editor is Cosgrove. Ilya comments on the word glotta and says it's an ominous word. Yes, it is an ominous word. I'll tell you where it's ominous. If you read the great saga of Burnt Njal, Njal saga, the character in it, if I may use the term, the really badass character in it is called Skarphedin Njalsen. And in that saga, Skarphedin Njalsen grins 9 times. It's his signature gesture. And every time he grins, it's bad news, really bad news. One of the attractive things about Old Norse literature, I think, is that they have got a strong sense of humor. But, you know, if you go on a dating site, people are always saying, advertising themselves as GSOH, good sense of humor. But in Old Norse, they only have a bad sense of humor, which I, of course, find very funny. But there, obviously, I have it's my Jutish ancestry breaking out when I think this is funny. So, I did a study once, actually, of how many times people laughed in Old English poetry. It's always a bad sign. Yes, the idea of kind of cheerful mirth is not really very prominent in Old English. By contrast, incidentally, you know, Tolkien's second favourite poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I once counted in that there are 27 occasions when people laugh. But, you know, the laughs are quite different. Sometimes it's amusement, sometimes it's giggling, sometimes it's aggressive. The Germans have 2 terms, gegeneinander lachen and miteinander lachen. You can laugh with someone or you can laugh against someone. Well, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has both. And sometimes, as at the end of the poem, you aren't quite sure which it is. It can be an ambiguous social sign. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said about laughter, and if I had the book handy, I would show it to you, because someone has just brought out a book called Laughter in Middle-earth. And it's edited by Thomas Honegger from Jena University. Well, Laughter in Middle-earth. Actually, Jennifer Raimundo, if she is listening, is one of the contributors to it. Is that right? Gosh, I can't. It's not handy, but certainly one of our number, I think, has contributed an article to it. So yeah, Laughter in Middle-earth, good book. If you can find it, you'll be amused by it, and instructed as well. I think I've got to the bottom of the questions now.
Very good. Very good. Well,
yes, I have. Here we are.
Yes,
and we're just past 10:30, so we're more or less on time for once.
I think so. I think so. Very good. Well, thanks everybody for joining us again. I look
Yeah,
forward to next week, the final installment, when we're going to talk about the 2014 Beowulf publication.
absolutely. Okay, bye everybody.
Very good. Thanks again very much, and we'll see everybody next week.
Yeah, good night.
Good night.
If you enjoyed this seminar, please consider making a small donation to Signum University. Your gift will help us continue to make the seminar series and other great content available for free to the public. Just go to signumuniversity.org/fund/donate/seminars. Thanks!